Member for Paran.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise to speak on the budget on behalf of the Victorian Greens. And it's unfortunate that this budget has been handed down under a cloud over this government and over this parliament because of this government's failure to do what's necessary and what's right with the rorting of the second home allowance by the former Speaker and Deputy Speaker. There was a clear course of action before them to refer those members to the Privileges Committee, just like it was with the former member for Frankston in the former government, and for that committee to investigate the matter further, propose any sanction, and for this House to vote on it. They've chosen not to do this in their attempt to avoid further scrutiny and further sanction, which is unfortunate, particularly when a budget is being handed down. It's clear that the government's actions in regard to this matter are driven purely by politics and makes the need for an independent Parliamentary Standards Commissioner all the more necessary. The government's proposed reforms still leave enforcement in the hands of MPs, and that simply isn't good enough. And this is a clear pattern of behaviour from this government, whose actions is not the actions of a government with integrity. We've seen it with the rorts for votes allegations of using electoral officers' staff to campaign during the election. The staff members who supposedly never met their MP they were supposed to be working for, donning red shirts and campaigning for the Labor Party, funded by the taxpayer, and now they're going to every length to delay, to obstruct the investigation, trying to stop the investigation in the Supreme Court and the High Court, losing both times. And now resorting in this House to move motions protecting their MPs. We've seen it with their cosy deals with Crown Casino, which makes it clear in this state what Crown Casino wants in Victoria, Crown Casino gets from this Labor government without a whimper from this Liberal opposition. First, with the Crown's licence extension, that would put the state at risk of paying them compensation should they dare act in the public interest that would affect their profits. This time we've got the Minister for Planning, the member for Richmond, who is out of his seat, mind you, changing the planning scheme to allow the Crown to build Melbourne's tallest building while dudding the taxpayer out of millions of dollars in public contributions they should be paying, dudding the state out of millions of dollars. We see it with their failure to act on political donations, still accepting donations from property developers and lobbyists, still refusing to lower the disclosure amount, still refusing to implement a real-time donations register. This Premier has said he believes the current arrangements are adequate. The current system is not adequate. It needs to change. We've seen it with their cosy deals with Transurban. Who are they putting in charge of transport planning for this state? Putting Transurban's profits before people. This state needs a real plan to keep Victoria livable in the face of population growth. This government puts Transurban, Crown Casino, property developers first, and it's got its priorities wrong. This budget means overcrowding on public transport is going to get worse, not better. Train patronage will grow by 2%, but services by just 1%. Tram patronage will grow by 4%, but services by just 1%. V-line patronage will grow by 4%, but services by just 0.5%. If your train or tram is overcrowded now, it is more likely that it will just get worse, just as it has every year under this government, all while the government is spending billions on new toll roads. The Westgate Tunnel is just another dodgy multi-billion-dollar toll road that doesn't stack up, just like the East-West Link. This time to be paid for by extending tolls for well over a decade. What a sweetheart deal. Transurban gets to continue making profits off Victorians. Victoria gets a road we don't need. $1 billion spent that could have been used to actually reduce congestion. Increased traffic pouring into the CBD. Urban renewal area E-Gate ruined. This is not the project that Melbourne needs. It's not even the project that Labor took to the last election. If they really wanted to get trucks off streets and trucks off the Westgate, they would have built the original Westgate off-ramps. That project could actually be built now for $500 million, not $5.5 billion. The truck ban on residential streets could be in place now. The Port Rail Shuttle, costing $58 million to shift freight to rail, could be built now. The completion of the Federation Bike Trail could be built now. We don't need another multi-billion-dollar tollway creating more traffic and diverting funding away from the projects we really need. And what hypocrisy to want to sign the contracts before the next election. We've got the North East Link. The North East Link, which is going to be going through some of our most environmentally sensitive areas. We've got the Minister for Roads spruiking this project, saying you'll be able to travel from Frankston to Altona without any traffic lights. Well, I lived in Frankston, and you'd be lucky to get anywhere without stopping at any traffic lights. My sister also happened to live in Altona, and I can tell you wouldn't travel from Frankston to Altona by travelling through Greensborough. The only vehicle that's going to make that trip is the Smart Bus Orbital. This government is calling it the missing link. The real missing link is Airport Rail. The real missing link is Doncaster Rail. The real missing link is Rowville Rail. Now, communities around Australia have stood up against expensive toll roads. East-West Link here in Melbourne, the Perth Freight Link, WestConnex in Sydney. Now, we know the Liberals want to waste $22 billion on the East-West Link, destroying the inner city, and no party that has the East-West Link as a policy can have any credibility on public transport, as is the case with the Liberals. Now, the government does like to point to its public transport projects. You know, look over there, you can't criticise us. They get very offended. Look what we're doing. We're doing more with the Liberals, which, to be fair, is true, but to be honest, isn't that hard. And it's worth looking back. Worth looking back at the Liberal record on public transport, who, after promises on feasibility studies to new rail lines, they finalised the alignment of the Melbourne Metro without South Yarra connection, I might add. Then nothing. They devoted all our money to the East-West Link, put Airport, Doncaster, Rover Rail in the too hard basket. No new trams were ordered. Barely any trains were built. Melbourne Metro, barely a cent was given to it before it was scrapped, to be replaced by the back of the napkin plan, the Melbourne Rail Link, just months out from the state election, which, whilst it did stop at South Yarra, it didn't connect to Flinders Street, didn't connect to the Melbourne's busiest train lines, didn't include high-capacity trains, so it's no wonder the Victorians can have so little trust in the Liberals when it comes to public transport. Now, this government is building Melbourne Metro, but this is not going to be built until 2026. This is not the silver bullet that's going to solve all our public transport problems. It's supposed to free up capacity for new train lines and new services, and the planning and construction needs to start now, or else we'll end up with the situation like we have following the completion of the regional rail link, where this government hasn't increased peak hour services despite the extra capacity on the network. We've been promised a new timetable every year since this government came to office, but they still haven't delivered. Now, in terms of new trains and trams, the new E-Class trams only continue the existing production levels of 10 trams per year, when production could double to 20 trams per year. The new high-capacity trains are only being built for Melbourne Metro. According to the government's rolling stock strategy, the high-capacity trains won't be on any other line until 2 elections away. And whilst the trial for the high-capacity signalling continues, this government has no plan to roll that across the entire network, and no plan to fill in the missing links on our tram network. Now, in Paran, we have a number of pressing needs on our public transport network, which is overcrowded. South Yarra Station has been neglected again, and this government is following on from previous Liberal and Labor governments not spending a cent upgrading South Yarra Station. It's a station that's bursting at the seams, high-rises going up next door. And I want to just get on the record, the member for Essendon saying it's a perfectly good station. Please, jump on the train, head down to Parliament, head down to South Yarra Station, and you tell the commuters at South Yarra Station that, and tell the residents who are living in Forest Hill that that's the case. Now, my recent survey found that commuters overwhelmingly want a connection with Melbourne Metro Rail, a second entrance with platform overpass, the wider Yarra Street crossing, or a safer Yarra Street crossing, and of course the heritage character maintained, I'd urge the government to actually start listening to South Yarra commuters and upgrade South Yarra Station. And if they're so determined not to connect it to the Melbourne Metro Rail project, at least follow through and ensure that it can be built at some point in the future. Now, I see the Liberals are keen to adopt the Greens' policy of including South Yarra in Melbourne Metro, and now having done absolutely nothing to build it, to fix the station during their term in government, trying to convince people that they can just conjure up a station using the planning scheme. It's not a planning motion that can actually connect South Yarra to Melbourne Metro. It takes a government to build it, and something that the Liberals failed to do in their term in office. Passengers at Hawkesburn, Toorak and Armidale stations are still waiting over 10 minutes during peak hour services, with trains too full to get on and express services passing the station. It's time this government increased peak hour services at those stations. Commuters at Sandringham Line aren't faring any better. A fifth of all services are overcrowded. No new peak hour services have been added for many years, and waits of 15 to 20 minutes during off-peak and weekends. Again, I'll take up that interjection. Sandringham runs on its own line. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Sandringham doesn't run through the city loop. It's very simple to run trains every 10 minutes during the weekend at off-peak. It's actually catered for in the Public Transport Victoria's Network Development Plan. It was supposed to be implemented years ago. This government hasn't done anything. And once again, it's very disappointing. It's very disappointing to see that, again, there is nothing for bikes again. Nothing for bikes again. The government promised $100 million for bikes and pedestrians at the last election, but we've seen nothing. We're still waiting for the St Kilda Road separated bike lanes to be announced, and this government has rejected a metre minimum passing distance despite all other states doing so. It's unfortunate that this government is going all in on toll roads when we need get cars off our roads with public transport and cycling. And I note, Speaker, as per usual, the member for Essendon was silent during the Shadow Treasurer's contribution, yet again interjects when the Greens are speaking. I'll just give you a word of advice, member for Essendon. Don't worry about interjecting when I'm speaking. Interject when your best mate in here, the member for Melton, is rorting the taxpayer. Will that yes man, will you ever hear him speak up against his best mate in here, the member for Melton? You won't hear him ever say that. Speaker, no plan for action on climate change can have any credibility if it doesn't plan for the end of coal. This budget is a lost opportunity to put in place an orderly transition away from coal, to put in place a plan to phase out coal-fired power stations and transition its workforce and communities. After a long campaign, our most polluting coal-fired power station, Hazelwood, has closed. And front and centre of this campaign has always been a just transition for workers and the community. Everyone saw this closure coming. Coal is on the way out. Companies are divesting themselves of coal-fired power. It's a bad bet. But just like Anglesey, this government didn't have a plan in place. And what hypocrisy. After spending the best part of 2 years criticising the Greens and my colleague, the member for Melbourne, for urging the government to act on Hazelwood and transition its workforce, I think the Attorney-General once said we couldn't shut Hazelwood because the TV would stop working and he couldn't watch the footy. But they changed their tune once it closed, and now they've had to belatedly put in a transition plan in place that is still being put together months after Hazelwood shut, leaving workers in the lurch. This government doesn't want to take the political heat for taking responsibility of Hazelwood closing and coal-fired power stations closure, but it wants to swoop in at the saviour as the last minute. This government has a choice. Put in place an orderly transition place for workers and the phase-out of coal-fired power stations, or simply leave it up to the market, which is getting out of coal, and leave workers in the lurch. Now, you couldn't find a more reckless energy policy than the opposition and the Liberals. It goes like this: scrap the Victorian renewable energy target, and spend untold millions on propping up polluting coal-fired power stations. Having privatised the power stations in the 90s, the Liberals now want to go to them with a blank cheque, and pay them whatever it takes to keep their ageing plants open. The Leader of the Opposition has said he wants to have a conversation with the owners of brown coal plants about what kind of support they needed to stay open. Now, I thought Tony Abbott's pay the polluters policy was bad, where the government would pay polluters to pollute less instead of having a price on carbon pollution, but this policy is even worse. It pays polluters to keep polluting. It pays polluters to keep polluting. This cash for coal policy makes it clear what a future Liberal government would mean. No action on climate change, paying polluters to pollute more, a dangerous climate, no transition plan for workers, and standing in the way of jobs in renewable energy and other clean industries. The Greens have a clear plan for a 90% renewables by 2030, a strong Victorian renewable energy target, investment in solar, wind, battery storage that can deliver clean, reliable, affordable energy. A one-for-one feed-in tariff so people with household solar can get a fair price for the energy they produce instead of getting ripped off by power companies. A plan to phase out coal-fired power stations and transition workers and their communities. At a time when the nation's energy market is broken, it's now time for a plan that works. We know coal-fired power stations are going to close. The question is when and what's in place for those workers and those communities. Now, Speaker, this budget is also a missed opportunity for our environment. Labor and the Coalition, their failure to transition the logging industry away from native forests to plantations is destroying our native forests and costing jobs. And as usual, the lies and the misinformation spread by the native logging proponents who are now lobbying to scrap the protections for the leadbeater's possum. It is mismanagement from Vic Forests that have caused job losses, not the protection of leadbeater's possum. And again, this government is scrambling at the last minute with an announcement they're going to buy the Hayfield plant. In this budget, we finally have an admission that plantations are the way to go, with $110 million to establish a timber plantation in Gippsland. Where was this decades ago? Labor went to the last election without an environment policy. The Liberals and Nationals went to the last election with a no new national parks policy. The Premier has set up a native logging task force, which to date has just resulted in business as usual, logging our native forests. The Greens have a clear policy to transition away from native forest logging to plantations, to create the Great Forest National Park on Melbourne's doorstep that will create jobs in regional communities in tourism, conservative and science, to create resilient forests that will reduce the risk of bushfire, to protect our water catchments, to protect the leadbeater's possum and other endangered species. 2 years ago, the Minister for Environment said she hoped the Great Forest National Park would become a reality in this term of government. Well, time is running out. Now is the time to create the Great Forest National Park. Deputy Speaker, plastic pollution is choking our waterways and killing our sea life. The Greens and communities across Victorians are calling for a ban on plastic bags and microbeads to stop plastic ending up in our oceans and our waterways. This government is opposed to that ban, and all they're doing is sticking up for the supermarket's bottom line. Local communities in other states are all getting on board with this change. The Greens have legislation before this parliament. It's time for this government to get on board too and ban plastic bags and microbeads. Now, I would just simply urge the government and urge the member for Oakleigh, if he's not familiar with the Greens bill to ban plastic bags, he can familiarise himself with that, and perhaps he can urge his colleagues to support that particular bill. Now, in regards to education, the Prahran community absolutely welcomes the extra funding for Prahran High School, an extra $37 million to take school funding to a total of $62 million. Now, this is a big win for local families who can be confident that they can access high-quality public education. Now, I love living in the inner city and raising my family there. More and more families are deciding to stay in the inner city, sending their kids to the local primary schools and now on to a local secondary school. It was incredible short-sighted that the Kennett government to close down and sell off the inner city schools local primary schools are experiencing a massive growth in enrolments. We now need transparency around future enrolment data so communities can have the confidence that their school will be upgraded and new schools will be built as their population grows. This information is held by the Department of Education. The Greens have called it for release, and that is also supported by Infrastructure Victoria. It's time for transparency in vocational education training funding as well. The TAFE reforms that were put in place by the former Brumby government and continued by the previous Livland government turned our training system into a get-rich-quick scheme for shonks and profiteers. We need to know how much money is going to these for-profit private providers and what return are we, as Victoria, getting for our investment in terms of quality and course completion. Yes, there are extra funds for TAFE. Yes, there are tighter rules for private providers, but we need a long-term plan that delivers the vast majority of our vocational education budget for recurrent funding to go towards our trusted, high-quality TAFEs. Now, in regards to community safety, neither this government or opposition has a plan to prevent crime. The government sees a need for a political fix. The opposition sees a need for a political opportunity. We are serious about crime prevention, reducing those reoffending rates, investing in communities. Now, let's be clear, the Coalition's plan for crime will result in more crime. Their changes to the sentencing is just shutting the gate before the horse has bolted. That will simply lead to increased reoffending. Shutting the gate after the horse has bolted and will simply lead to increased reoffending, more money spent on prisons with a revolving door. And the Labor Party has followed them down the rabbit hole, implementing opposition's policies. And where has that got us? We were told creating new offences for acts that were already illegal was going to reduce crime. It didn't. We were told that having mandatory minimums would help. It hasn't. If the Coalition's approach to crime worked, it would already be working now because the government keeps implementing their policies. Now, the government's handling of youth justice has been shameful. This is a crisis that could have been avoided had this government took the right action. Both this government and the last have ignored warnings that our youth justice facilities were like tinderboxes. Decisions made have led to an increase in children being remanded in custody and not enough staff to cope, and the increase in the use of lockdowns, solitary confinement. The government's response was to illegally transfer children to adult jails. We had this so-called progressive premier out there telling everyone that adult prison was where these children deserved to be. These children who were Indigenous, part of the child protection system, suffering mental illness and had a disability. And the government's response was to act unlawfully. We know there is a small cohort of young, violent offenders, and this issue needs to be dealt with. But these measures, locking kids up in a prison-style institution, is going to make this problem worse, and it will not make this community, our community, safer. Now, the government's response has been to transfer responsibility of youth justice to the Corrections Department, and it is clear with this is heading to another Dondale situation. This government needs to change course, invest in justice reinvestment, diversionary programs and intensive therapeutic programs for those young people who need it, and address the systemic issues in our communities and our state. Now, in my portfolio area of LGBTI, certainly welcome the funding for health and wellbeing for LGBTI Victorians, even though there is a little detail as to what that actually is. And it has been incredibly disappointing over this term in Parliament to see the path that the Liberal Party has taken in opposing laws that were so critical to the transgender community and proposing to scrap safe schools. But we still need further legislative reform in this term of Parliament to protect workers, students, service users from discrimination that is still allowed in our Equal Opportunity Act. Both the government and the opposition opposed the Greens Equality for Students bill, and I'd urge them to rethink their opposition to changes to the Equal Opportunity Act. There is still so much more to be done, particularly in the area of LGBTI homelessness, where they are too greater overrepresented. The issues facing the intersex community and gay conversion therapy and the ex-gay movement, which still occurs. Now, in terms of revenue, this government is continuing on its sell-off agenda, flogging every asset that isn't nailed down, handing control of key public assets to the private sector and driving up costs for Victorians. Following off the sell-off of the Port of Melbourne, which Labor railed against in the 90s when Kennett started asset sales, we now see the Land Titles Office up for grabs. And the result is simple. A short-term hit of cash, the state loses regular income from dividends of the asset, and we hand over control of that asset to the private sector, and the private owners trying to squeeze more water from the rock, driving up costs for users while service levels drop. The government is wanting to raise taxes, but is doing so at a time when local councils are being hit by a rate cap. With some councils, that's essentially $1 million out of services and infrastructure. What hypocrisy. And this policy, of course, will hit rural councils most of all, and the coalition just rolled over and let it happen. And this is when the government's spending billions on new toll roads, billion for the Grand Prix, promoting duck shooting and propping up Vic forests. So to conclude, Deputy Speaker, this budget is a missed opportunity to keep Victoria livable. We need to invest more in public transport to reduce overcrowding and traffic congestion. We need to plan to phase out coal and replace it with clean energy and new jobs. We need to create a Great Forest National Park to ban plastic bags to prevent plastic pollution. We need to stand up to One Nation Islamophobia, not pander to it like the opposition. We need to change the Equal Opportunity Act to show all LGBTI Victorians are protected by the law from discrimination. We need to make sure that health and school funding goes to where it's needed most. We need to be investing in communities to reform our youth justice system and child protection system, and we need to ensure that transparency, integrity and accountability at the heart of all our decisions. The government and the opposition in this budget have shown they are incapable of doing this. The Greens have a plan to make it happen.